Hello there. Today we'll be looking at Kamigawa Dynasty Limited Archetypes. Normally when we do this, we tackle two color decks. So there's 10 of them. Today will be a little bit different because we'll look at one monocolored deck, mono red, as well as the 10 two-color decks, and then one kind of fun 5-color deck that's based off of getting a Mythic early in the draft. Normally for these templated decks, we're just looking at common and uncommons, as these are cards that you could reasonably expect to get within the draft, depending on how you navigate the draft and what packs are open. We don't include rares or mythics, as these have much lower odds of being open so that you can draft them. Also, we limit it to 2 of any common and 1 of any uncommon, and just try and make this more realistic. So just a little bit of review of the numbers for Kamigawa Neon Dynasty. Towards the end of the format, mono red decks were the only monocolor deck that was played with any reasonable amount, with a very good win rate over 60%. For our 2-color decks, we'll see win rates ranging from a little under 54% with Boros, up to the 58%. Like the Demir, Golgari, and Rakdos. And then we do have some 3-color decks that tended, if they're straight 3-color, tend to not do well. There was good mana fixing, but not quite enough to normally allow for a true 3-color deck to consistently perform. And then we're 5-color decks that were not played very often. So oftentimes this would either be someone who had a bit of a train wreck and just tried to throw it all in there, or someone who had the deck draft go really well. And we'll look at a deck that might look like a draft going really well. So we'll start out with mono red, and then we'll dip into the decks that had the highest win rates. Tier 1, black red, blue black, black green, and we'll include mono red in that first tier. And our second tier with white green, white blue, green blue, oftentimes splashing white, and black white. And then our third tier of blue red, red green, and white red. So starting out with mono red, something that you'll notice is red, generally speaking, only plays well with itself. There are some red decks that'll play well with black in them, and sometimes with blue, but tend not to play well with green or with white in this set. So if you are red, ideally you would be mono red. Helps with mana issues. Oftentimes, if you get a low enough curve, you can be running, 14, 15, maybe 16 lands. This templated deck here is running 15 lands with 1 functional land. There are many artifacts and potentially enough enchantments to draw 2 with this, oftentimes at least drawing 1 to give you a little bit of card draw if the game does go to an intermediate length or even a long length. And just as a reminder, cards that we're looking at for 2 of tend to be those that have high either game in hand or with a deck like this maybe opening hand win rates, as it is trying to go very aggressive, very fast, or potentially have good win rates but also fill a need that might otherwise not be filled by other cards but is needed in the deck. So cards with the highest win rates are Iron Apprentice, and then Kami's Flare and Voltage Surge. Iron Apprentice is probably your best red, quote-unquote, red common in this set, as the modular ability can be really helpful when you're looking at adding on counters with like a Kamana Faces Kakazan, or sacking it to like a Smeltzer, and distributing those counters to another creature, or just proccing artifact benefits, like Automaton, for example, or Kami's Flare dealing damage to the face. Ways you would get into red. Oftentimes, you could, if you opened one of the very strong red uncommons, like a Kamana Faces Kakazan or a Twin-Shot Sniper, or a Smeltzer, you may start in red and just stay in red. There are other times where you may open up like a Circuit Mender, which fits in pretty much any deck, or potentially an Automaton, which is more of a mono-red card, but could go into like a heavy, a deck that has heavy artifacts that might be blue, with red, or maybe black, depending on how the draft's going. But those are kind of all first pickable cards that you're happy to first pick. If you don't see those, then what may happen is you may start out with another focus, and then you may see those past, pick, 3, 4, 5, and it may be worth jumping in and saying, this deck might be open. I'm happy to draft this deck if it is open. It has very high power and can play well in the metagame, but probably not jumping in initially for just, like a Kami Slayer or a Voltage Surge, unless the pack is exceptionally weak. In terms of ways the gameplay normally goes, you want to get on the board early. So that oftentimes means if you can, like a Rabbit Battery or Kamana Faces Kakazan, and then follow it up with some type of creature that's going to have some benefit in the early to late games, like Automaton to be growing in size, Song Shaper to oftentimes be attacking for 3 or 4, or potentially a Hover Bike to tap a creature so that on your turn you can swing for even more damage. This game is meant to be played quick if you're the mono red deck, but you can oftentimes run out of gas and just be a few points away. So cards like Synthesizer that can help extend your reach a little bit by getting your board bigger, maybe drawing another card that you can play that turn, are useful. Cards like Circuit Mender that maybe could be like sack to a Smelter or might trade in combat, and drawing another card to continue applying pressure can be useful. And then if you are looking at top end, Shattered States Era in Iron 4 did tend to play pretty well in this deck. Oftentimes we see these steal a creature effect, really being intentional on having a way to sack the creature that you've stolen, which can sometimes happen with a Smelter, but oftentimes you're just saying, I'm getting my board wide enough, I'm going to take your creature that either has trample or is a good blocker, and I'm just going to swing all out and try and do the final points of damage. Ways to help facilitate that are, the trample and pump with the board, either used early to trample over a creature and keep your creature alive, or use late to push through some damage. Or potentially even Gift of Wrath, which has a good win rate, about 58, 59 in this deck, as a way to just add some evasion with Menace. Particularly if you can get a Wrath on a Hover Bike or an Automaton, can be very useful. And then also, if they do kill the creature, as long as they don't kill it when you're playing the Gift of Wrath, you always get another creature back, 2/2, that also has Menace, so you can continue applying pressure. This deck does tend to like cards that other decks are not going to like. So like Unstoppable Ogre is fine in this deck, but it is a way to clear out blockers for a turn so you can continue attacking. Most other decks don't want this. Same with Song Shaper because you're heavy artifact focused, and even Sling to continue either putting on like a flyer or putting on another creature and just attacking in. And if they block, you at least get one to the face and maybe do the final points that way. It's a tricky deck to play because oftentimes you'll see, because so much costs 1 and 2 mana, there are multiple decisions in the early first few turns that you're having to make. But it is a very high power deck if you can get it to come together. So it's a deck that you can get in from the first pick, but oftentimes it's after a couple picks and you see that it's open and then you just lean in. Potentially closely related to mono red is black red, and there's a couple different ways to draft this deck. The one that's presented here is based on the assumption that if you are trying to go red or trying to go black, but you actually need to pair a second color to make sure you make playables, then this is fairly evenly split. But there are oftentimes where you start out mono red and you don't quite hit playables, but you're picking up like the Clawing Torments or the Reckoner Raids that are very strong in this deck for getting incidental life, taking away blockers with like the Torment, that you would like to play if you are in a second color and the second color is black. And this could be a heavier red focus deck like the mono red we looked at before. Alternatively, if you're fortunate enough to be drafting a lot of black cards that are strong, loaded to the ground, multiple raids, virus beetles, maybe some strong uncommons like Life of Toshiro, Clawing Torments, and you need to supplement with red, then you can do that. And oftentimes that's going to be the uncommons, like the snipers, or maybe some good removal that's cheap, like Kami's Flare or Voltage Surge, so you don't have to play the 4 mana Twisted Embrace, for example, or the Assassin's Ink that is between 2 and 4 mana. That's another way to do this, but this is one that's kind of middle of the road that should perform well. And again, we have our very strong commons, and the Clawing Torment and the Reckoner Raid, as well as Vulture Surge. Kamigawa tended to play a little better in the mono red because you had more modular creatures. You had a creature that had, a +1/+1 counter, or had, an aura on it. It's not quite as common in this one, so Voltage Surge does tend to play a little bit better. And then because you are looking at needing both red and black mana, it's a little easier to say, okay, well, I've got a 1 mana play that'll open up some of my, other plays where I need to have my black mana, or potentially if you had like an Assassin's Ink, this might need like 2 black mana or an Embrace. But again, this is low to the ground, tries to get on the board early, apply pressure. This version oftentimes has a little better reach because you'll have some more flyers like 1 or 2 Inkrise Infiltrators, maybe a Gravelighter to like sack an Apprentice, pump up a creature, Hoverbike. And then also the Onicult Anvil is a reason to play your black with your red. As because you're so heavy artifact focused, this sometimes get the final points of damage. And if you have more than one of these, you can oftentimes just not have to get through with attacking once your opponent's at about 8 to 10 life. And you can just stabilize and burn them out that way, or drain them out that way. If you're getting into this deck, oftentimes it's either like the mono red decks before, you either open a really good uncommon like the Smelter, Kimono, Twin Shot Sniper, Automaton, or you're starting out in black and that kind of dries up. You see red starting to flow, and you don't get quite enough for the mono red. You end up a black red deck that's low to the ground that can play well. This is a deck that can play 15 lands if you have a low enough curve, but because you're 2 different colors, you're going to want probably at least one of these dual lands, which makes it a little awkward because you have so many 1-drops. But the nice thing is, you're not playing Synthesizer on 1. You're almost never playing Clawing Torment on 1 unless you have a kind of slower hand and they play like a Generous Visitor. Or maybe you consider if they played like a Network Disruptor and you're going second, and you're afraid they're going to ninjutsu off of that and get the value trend rolling and you won't be able to catch up. But usually you're saving that for like a Defender creature or a bigger creature that you couldn't otherwise tack through, that you're fine to just try and race. And then one thing to note, our strongest black commons just globally for the set are Reckoner Raid, Virus Beetle, and then not pictured here, Twisted Embrace. And a deck like this, it's tough to play Twisted Embrace because of its double black requirement and being 4 mana. When you can kill many of the other creatures, with like a kicked, Voltage Surge, if you want to think about it that way, by sacking an artifact, or maybe a Kami's Flare, or you just make it not matter, you go around it with the Clawing Torment. So Twisted Embrace tended to not play super well in this black-red, low to the ground, aggressive deck. And then Virus Beetle was fine. You still have the artifact like benefits, like the Automaton, Smelters, but it tended to not play quite as well in this deck as the Reckoner's Raid, because this comes down on the first turn. You can get it going. It has Menace, so it's tougher to block it and other creatures, so it can actually push through damage. Whereas the Beetle's trying to say, let's try and play a smaller game. I'm going to play my card, get you to discard a card, have at least a 1-for-1. And maybe this will trade with something or get sacked, and it ends up being a 2-for-1 for me. But that doesn't work quite as well when you're trying to play so quickly that the opponent will hopefully still have cards left in their hand, when you deal your final points of damage. So that just as a note, if you're starting your draft with, pick 1, pick 2 Virus Beetles, they'll be fine in black-red, but maybe you're looking at playing like a black-blue or black-white deck if those colors are open, rather than black-red if you're already leaning into the Virus Beetles. And then Onicult Anvil, like I said, is a big payoff for the deck, but it's tough to pick this pack 1, pick 1, unless it's just a weak pack, or you just really know how to navigate the draft, and you feel like, red is underdrafted enough to where you can do that, because if you're heavy black, you're probably not going to have enough artifacts to have this consistently proccing and continuing to just drain every turn. You really need to be heavy enough red to make use of this. That's just something to keep in mind. And then this is a deck that's happy to play vehicles. Your Brute Suit can make your Iron Apprentice, your Virus Beetle work really well, or you might have like a Rabbit Battery, or maybe if you did it with some slings that are okay but not great in black-red, you can crew with the creature, and then you can reconfigure it onto another creature, and still, get its ability. You know, its haste or its +1/+1, you know, stuff like that. Again, because there are so many cheaper plays, the first turns are very important, and it's oftentimes tricky to navigate in those, you know, first, you know, 3 to 7 turns or so. But it does have better reach than mono red at the cost of having like less mana and a little less focused. You're going to notice that black is in 3 of these top 4 decks because it is probably, at least at the common and uncommon, you know, the strongest color in the set. And part of that is because there were just, you know, 3 very good commons. But then also because it's kind of in that middle of like the artifact focus and the enchantment focus, it can kind of get benefit from both of those. So here we have a blue-black deck, which doesn't necessarily have to be a ninja deck. But you will see that some of the better cards can be ninjas. So like Moonstruck Hacker can be a very good card on turn 2, you know, or on turn, you know, 8. Same with Silver Master, because there are, you know, other, you know, rogues and ninjas that may get pumped up for it, whether it's like an Inkrise Infiltrator, your Reckoner Raid is a Rat Rogue, for example, can be beneficial. And enough ninjas to be able to say, okay, I can bring back my Virus Beetle, I can bring back one of my really strong sagas like a Long Reach, a Life, a Reckoner Raid, potentially. It can be really nice. Or even, you know, if your opponent has put like an arrest or something on your creature, you might be able to bounce it back and then play it again. That's how this deck can oftentimes generate just incremental advantage. But a big way for this deck to be successful is, you know, ideally get on the board turn 1, like a Raid or a Disruptor, which is why there's, you know, 2 of them in this templated deck. They had very high win rates in the deck, and then come on strong with a very good turn 2 play. Either, you know, return the Disruptor to hack or draw a card, or do a Modern Age so you can filter to what you really need, especially if you're playing this deck with 16 lands, which you could oftentimes do if you had enough card draw like Modern Age, Hacker. Then you can make that work. Or you get a Beetle on turn 2, and then you put the opponent to the test, especially if you're on the play, and you can go, you know, any card or just land, and turn 2 Beetle, play your 3rd land and attack. You know, if they don't block, you ninjutsu it back with, you know, with a Hacker, with a Specialist, with a Silver Master. If they do block, you got Suit up there to kill their creature and cantrip, which just made it so brutal. So Soup, another card that nothing else really does this in the format. Like, there is, you know, you're already dead for a single black, but you had to, you know, have your creature deal that damage, and oftentimes, you know, your Beetle is going to die, or your Hacker is going to die, for example. And then, then you trade your 1 card for their card, and you draw cards. So that's okay, but this isn't a deck that is really looking to trade off resources if it can. Is looking to get ahead by having its cards do more than one thing. And then if you are playing a lower to the ground version of this, which ideally you would do, you do like cards like Modern Age, which you would say, oh, you know, this isn't a ninja, it's not super aggressive, but it generates value. It gives you card filtering, so if you need lands, you can get lands. If you don't need lands, you get rid of lands, for example, and keep your gas. And then it can be ninjutsu back to your hand if you need to, or it's just a flyer. And 2/3 flyer was pretty good in this format. It wasn't great because there was, you know, the Archer, 1 in green for 3/3 reach. But if you've got one of your Clawing Torments, you put on the Archer, you're in great shape to just, you know, fly over them, or even attack past them on the ground. They don't stabilize. So cards that were pretty irreplaceable, that were very good in this deck, but not great in other decks were Suit Up. And then to an extent, Clawing Torment. It plays very well in blue-black, plays very well in black-red. It's not great in black-green because that's a little more grindy, value-y slower. And then it's fine in black-white, but that's a little more value-y grindy as well. So these are the 2 pairs if you're really looking to kind of pick it up if you're in black. And then ideally you're getting into this deck either with some early strong sagas like a Behold, a Long Reach, Life of Toshiro, or like okay sagas like Reckoner Raid and Modern Age are still very good, but not as good as those for the most part. Or maybe just get a Mender and does these colors end up open? Or maybe you go into some raids and beetles, and then you get some blue to supplement it with. But this is a deck where oftentimes you're looking to get your, blue cards and black cards, pretty. If you have a lot of blue or a lot of black, that's fine as long as they're good cards. You can supplement with like the suit ups and the modern ages and hackers. And oftentimes you are picking like the hackers and the modern agers ahead of the disruptor. Even in this deck, like you want to have turn 1 plays, you want to help your ninjas get in, but if you are able to deplete them of resources, like your long reaches with your beetles, maybe make the creatures not be able to block, then you can get in fine, or make it tough for them to block with suit ups. Yeah, you can make it where you can get in even without having something to tap it down in a flyer. So you probably don't want to be first picking disruptor unless it's just like an awful pack. But again, this is a deck that probably has one of the highest ceilings, but you do need some of the uncommons to really be able to hang, because you're not going to finish the game on turn 4, 5, or 6. So you may get into some of the intermediate game where the value decks may be able to stabilize. So you need some ways to have some reach and get through, and whether that's flying, just draining a turn, getting rid of the resources, that's a way to do it. And then our last deck in Tier 1 is black-green. In the beginning of format, this deck was just, doing fantastic because green was not overdrafted. You could oftentimes, get people passing you, as slaves. You pick 4 to 6 in the first pack, Boseijus or Captech Wreckers or Blossom Prancers, which are 3 of the top 10 uncommons and, probably 3 of the top 25 cards in the set. The reasons to go into green, those cards. Whereas, at least currently where we are in the metagame, and oftentimes this occurs because there's enough information out there when it comes back to like a quick draft, or maybe you're playing with your friends or something and they know the format, is you're not going to get green passed to you like you did before. So you're going to be happy to have these 3 green uncommons, but you shouldn't necessarily expect to have multiples of them like maybe you could in the past. And then here we do have our best black commons showing up. All 3 of them. Reckoner Raid's great because you do like enchantments in this deck to either bring them back to hand or bring them back from the graveyard with like a season. Or potentially just proc some of the benefits of enchantments. And then you have your 2 virus beetles to try and outvalue the opponent. You're happy to play a slightly smaller game to give you time to get a good Saga down on 4, or get like an Emergence down on 5 with protection from a safekeeping, or maybe a Twisted Brace down on 5 with protection from a safekeeping, and then just kind of take them out. But a deck like this oftentimes ends up going taller with like 1 or 2 bigger threats like a Boseiju, Prancer, Emergence, rather than wider like your Ninja deck might or your Mono Red deck might, for example. And then one thing you'll see in these decks that have green, if you can support it, is this Sky Turtle Season Renewal loop. And oftentimes, because you have good enough fixing with the dual lands, you can afford to have a splash for a 3rd color. If you have the Sky Turtle Season, it's probably worth splashing that. If not, you could very well have 1 or 2 Imperial Oaths, 5 and a white. Make your 3/2/2 scry 3. Because this deck isn't going to be super quick to the point where you're like, oh, I can't play that. You're happy to play a 6 mana, go a little wider, stabilize so that you can build up your taller creatures and be good. And then one thing to note, not in here, but you can play those geothermal commies, 3 and green. You can bounce an enchantment back to your hand, gain 3 life, like replay your Twisted Embraces, replay your Gloom Shriekers, for example, or if you've had a creature that's been arrested, it's a enchantment creature, you'll bring that back to hand. Those played really well in the beginning of the format, where you could get multiple like sagas and Twisted Embraces. That's a little tough to do that now, so the numbers have kind of tapered off a bit on that. But the way you normally would get into this deck is either you start in black, like we talked about the other black decks, with like the Beetles, the Raids, maybe Embrace or Life, and then you see some green come, and you're like, okay, I'm happy to take a pick 4 Capitech Wrecker because at least 2 people, maybe all 3 of them, are not in green or like a Beseju or a Prancer. But these do tend to be, unless green is just really flowing, a little heavier black. That being said, if you can get the green, a card like a Harmonious Emergence is really good in this deck to play offense and defense because of the vigilance. But because you are going tall, you really want to have 1 and at least probably 2 Tameo safekeepings to sort of counter an opponent's removal spell, keep your creature alive, and be able to keep beating with it, or help protect you when you go for like a spinning wheel kick with your Beseju or your Prancer or your Sky Turtle. So this plays kind of value mid-range, but it can play a little longer game if you have the Oath or the Sky Turtle season loops. But you do need the mana to support that. So that's tier 1. If we get on to tier 2, we've got white-green with kind of our next highest win rate. And this is a deck that tends to be very heavy enchantment focused. So I mean, if you look at the numbers in this templated deck, we've got 12 enchantments, plus our 17 lands, makes a card like Communal Spirits all right. But something to remember is probably your best cards in the deck, and the reason you may end up in these colors are Imperial Oath, Prancer, Capitech Wrecker, and you're not going to find any of those with Communal Spirits. So yeah, this might help you fix some, find your splash color if you're splashing, but you probably don't want to overload with Communal because you're probably going to miss on those cards you really, really want if you have them. And then this is like many decks in the format. It wants to have many of these cards that are cheaper so it can like double spell, triple spell. But then also it is looking to play a slightly longer game. This doesn't have as much value as some of like the blue-black, for example, or the black-green. Like, yeah, hopefully you are playing your Spirited Companions to draw cards, and maybe you can like bring that back to your hand with the Capitech Wrecker, or bring a Mishko back to your hand with the Capitech Wrecker. But it's not nearly as value-driven as some of the other decks. So you really have to like protect your resources, your really important cards. So like having 1 or 2 safekeepings to protect your real threats up here at the upper end, and having enough removal to be able to push through. So a card like Repel the Vile tends to be pretty good in a deck like this, and it's probably similar to Fade to Antiquity that will just roll exile an artifact or an enchantment. So this gives you a little more leeway with also being able to get a creature that might not be a artifact or enchantment type of creature. But both are good in a deck like this. It's like a one of oftentimes. And like your Rebuke and Spell Kick, Will Kick, your Spirit Realm, to be able to get cards out of the way so you can continue attacking. And then this is one where you do want to have the option to go wide and not have to go tall. So as many Oaths as you can get, you'll play. If you're looking at 3 or more Oaths, you may consider finding a place for some ramp, whether it's like Azusa or even like a Greater Tanuki to channel, or like a terminal for 3 for the artifact to be able to ramp up some. You're happy to play those when you start getting more Oaths, particularly because this does end up being a 17 land deck most of the time. Even if you are getting some card draw and making some stuff cheaper, you want to be able to cast Oath as soon as you can, not miss your mana to where you aren't able to cast a Beseju if you have 1 or 2 of those, or a Prancer on curve. This deck tends to be okay against the aggro decks if it can stabilize with, like an Archer or a Prancer, and then go over the top by getting like either wide enough with Oath or like a Flyer, for example. But sometimes that can be tough if the opponent knows to like put a Clawing Torment on your Archer, or take out your ways to like ramp with the Naturalist, or just a Torment on your Beseju. So it can get a little tricky. So oftentimes you end this deck again with starting out with some green uncommons, and then green's open enough, and you see some white to pair with it, rather than like some black, for example. And I would say you get into for Oath, but Oath is so splashable that you don't need to be in white to play Oath, as we'll see, in another deck pretty soon. So another deck that kind of evolved as the format went on was white-blue. And if you look at the signpost uncommon Prodigy's prototype, you'd say, gosh, this needs to be a vehicle deck. But that didn't really turn out to be the case. Vehicles didn't play exceptionally well because there was enough value and enough reasonable removal to where oftentimes you just couldn't really lean in heavy next. You might not have any creatures to create your vehicles. Whereas a method that did work for blue-white was, and you could play like a tempo-y version. This isn't that, because this is a more consistent version, is get on the board early with cards that have good defensive speed, like your Heir of Enlightenment or your Golden Tail Disciples. It can stop the aggro decks. And then you just, play Oath into Oath, get some flyers with like a Behold potentially, or your Modern Age that's flipped over to a Vector Glider, and finish the opponent off that way. So stay alive and then finish with overwhelming them or some flyers. Now, because blue and white aren't really great at removing threats, you did want to try and do some prioritization of ways to do that. So either that meant splashing for like black for like life or long reach, or playing some of your white removal like Touch Spirit Realm with Banishing Slash, or even playing Disruption Protocol, which played fairly well in this deck, even though oftentimes you didn't have an artifact to tap to turn this into like a counter spell rather than like a cancel. It still played well enough for you to be able to double spell. You might be on turn 5 and you play Modern Age and you leave up Disruption Protocol, for example. If you didn't have a better player, you're expecting your opponent to try and drop like a 5-mana Saga when you some good 5-mana creature. Having that available makes it so they don't get destabilized. Maybe you have a Saga that's getting ready to flip, or you're attacking with like a Moon Circuit Hacker, for example, and you're just able to continue dealing little points of damage so that you can finish off with like a flyer or oath. You could, if you really needed the removal, you could splash green for like a Fade to Antiquity to get rid of like artifacts and enchantments. It wasn't like a desirable thing to do, but you did need some degree of removal because the games are going a little bit longer. And if they have, like a, Sky Turtle that they end up playing, or they, play like a Kiki Jiki Saga, they're going to outvalue you if you don't have a way to get rid of it, for example. So even a card like Fall Lord Kondo, which is somewhat polarizing, was fine in a deck like this because you had enough defensive speed with these other cards that you could afford this being a dead card against like a mono red or maybe like a black red deck. This was a fun deck to play, but it was oftentimes still in that kind of tier 2. You would get into this by usually starting off with like a strong blue card like your Behold or maybe like a Modern Age, and then your white becomes available and maybe you're like black and green are cut, and you just get these defensive white cards and some oaths, and you just try and go to town that way. Now we're on the second half of these tier 2 decks, and this is ostensibly a green-blue deck, but the green and blue just didn't really pair super well together, and because it was easy enough to splash Imperial Oath, these decks would often do well by setting up like a good early defensive game with like Fanged Shigekis, Baby Grove Archers, and then playing their good, blue and or white cards like the Behold, the Imperial Oaths, the Modern Ages. And in particular, these worked well in this deck because if you can shore up the ground with your Archer, with your Shigekis, and maybe a Keptech Wrecker, then oftentimes you could fly over with your Vision of the Unspeakable or your Vector Glider. Or if you short up the ground, you had some reasonable removal like Rebukes and Fades, then you could overwhelm them with Imperial Oath tokens. So it was a deck that did need to be heavy green though. So you had to realize, if you're not, opening these green uncommons and getting past some green uncommons, then you're probably going to end up in a deck that isn't good in these colors because the blue and green don't play super well together. So you're just kind of getting in trouble. So it really needs to be heavy green focus. And then, like others, because you're not going to be able to play a very quick game with these colors. You're looking at playing a more drawn out game. You know, if you had like the Season Skytoral Loop or the Os, you could hope to win in those turns, 8 to 12 against other decks. And then just kind of a note here, Sunblade Samurai did tend to work well when you were splashing multiple Os because you could use it to plane cycle for all intents and purposes. It's a channel ability to get the planes that you need, so you didn't have to play as many planes. But if you did draw your planes naturally, then you could just play the Samurai or play your Os. So it was a useful card to pick up, mid, to end of a pack, thinking you might splash some Os. And then again, because we're going a little taller, you have threats that you need to keep alive, like your Behold, your Modern Age. It was useful to have safekeepings. And then our last tier 2 deck was Black-White. And we'll see this was just hoping to generate value from the accumulation of artifacts and enchantments. So cards that were 2 of in this templated out deck were, if you can get 2 or more Rage, you're always going to play those. Beetle, Companion. These were somewhat at odds in that Beetle wants you to have a smaller game, and Companion wants you to have a bigger game by drawing cards, getting more resources out there. Both tended to play well, though, because you could play the mid-ranging game where, depending on what your opponent's doing, one might be better than another, and you aren't necessarily going to know that on turn 2. But if you had like multiple O's or 4 drops, you might lean a little more to having a Companion if you had to choose between the 2. But just in the dark, Beetle tends to be a little bit better card, and because, as you'll see in this like templated version, we have fewer artifacts and enchantments, it's just tougher to get artifacts in white. They weren't really there. You had enchantments in white. You could get artifact or enchantment in black, but you really needed the artifacts to proc like your Column of Terrible Secrets, for example, that you would preferentially add in an artifact compared to an enchantment if you had to choose between the 2, like in the draft. And then you could oftentimes splash if you got enough duels. So something that was useful in helping generate more value, in particular because you had these creatures you were more than happy to pick up, like a Beetle and Companion, was getting in a Tech Wrecker if you can, and then getting in a Gloom Shrieker to bring back a permanent, like your Kami or one of your Sagas or your Tech Wrecker, were really useful. And then this was a deck that if you could outvalue your opponent and then drop an Oath on them on turn, 6, 7, 8, you could oftentimes just finish them because you've dealt some little chip damage with the raids. Maybe you snuck in for some points here or there. Maybe you're able to, make your opponent have like a poor block by using like a Touch the Spirit Realm or something like that, to where you can get a 2-for-1 with some of your bigger creatures. You could do well. And then this was a deck where Shrine Steward tended to play well because oftentimes you'd have 1 or more Twisted Embrace. You might have an Intercessor's Rest. You could pick those up. So you're getting like a 2-for-1 with that. And then it was another artifact that helped make things better. Like ideally you would have cheaper artifacts like your Menders and your Beetles or your Hover Bikes, so you could play your Kami on turn 4 and have it be exceptional as a 3/4 draw card, gain a life. But it was still useful to have, a Shrine Steward. So ways you get in this deck, you'd start out with stronger black cards, and then you'd see, blue maybe wasn't open, and maybe green wasn't really open. So you pair it with white cards that are generating value, like your Companions, like your Banishing Slash. If you can proc the 2/2 that you get off of this, your Imperial Oaths. Or maybe you started with a little bit of green, and then you went into back, and green just dried up, and you supplemented with white. That's another way they do it. That you do need the lands to make it work. And then this is an ideal deck for Roadside Reliquary because you should have, 5+ artifacts and enchantments. So just be careful. You don't necessarily want to have like a big splash and make it tough to like miss your main color because you're splashing. Plus you have this land that only produces colorless mana. So just be careful with that. And again, have enough removal because you are playing like a intermediate to maybe long game, so you need to be able to kill like their Tameshis or their Mythic Dragon or things like that. So like Embrace, these arrest type cards, Basing Slash are very useful. Have at least a critical mass at removal. There were variants of this that could play more long reaches and like the 2 and a black discard 2 spell, but those weren't the ideal version. So usually you're playing the good 2 drops, and then you're getting value with your 4 drops and your 6 drop. So now we're down to the bottom of the barrel, the generally regarded as tier 3 decks. So blue-red's probably the best of that, and this deck can play well if you're heavy red, and you supplement just a little bit with a few blue cards like Suit Ups and Hackers, maybe Moonslayer Specialists, or if you're just heavy blue and you supplement with just a few red cards like your Snipers or your like Voltage Surges. The example here understands that you may not be able to end up in those almost monocolor decks. So if you are really more true 2-color, then you're trying to have some synergies on the artifact side, but you'll notice, 11 artifacts is still good, but it's not the same as like our mono red or like our red black. That might be like 15 plus artifacts, despite this being supposed to be like the artifact color pair. So a card that I thought would be better, like Enthusiastic Mechanaut, really only reduces the cost of a few of these cards really. So keep that in mind, as it maybe isn't like a pull into blue red, but just a nice card to have as a 2/2 flyer for 2. That may help in some other ways. But kind of like your other red decks, you're looking to try and get on the board early with like an Apprentice or a Kamano, and then you're going to try and have some snowballing advantage. In particular, you get the advantage of Suit Up to be able to draw a card and kill like an opponent's creature, or you might be able to bring your Kamano back to your hand with like a Hacker, for example, or a Circumventer back to your hand, and that can be really useful. But because this deck didn't have too many things that played well together, it was tough to find it to be exceptionally it really had to come together. And oftentimes if you had enough good blue, you could find another color to supplement than red, or if you had enough good red, you could find another color to supplement other than blue. So it's not necessarily where you wanted to be, but it wasn't the worst of the worst. But oftentimes you did want to have a deck that was lower on lands, lower to the ground, to try and push through with your early damage, and then hopefully finish with some flyers. Whether it's like a Hover Bike or a Behold, or even like a Skyswarm Koi, it was pretty useful to have some filtering, so you could like get rid of extra lands or find the card you really need to push through. That was ideally how this deck would play out. And then our last 2 decks just oftentimes were tough to come together. Red-green, quote-unquote modified, and white-red, quote-unquote samurai. We'll see that these decks generally did not play well if you want those themes, but rather, and like red-green, you wanted to be, if you could, heavier on the green, just good cards, and then supplement with some like good red removal, so you can have double spell on turns. You can play a Boseiju or play a Tails, and also have like a safekeeping up or a removal spell up. Or you could get on the board early with like your Kamano, a Trainee, a Tech Wrecker, and then protect it, with some removal until you get to some of your bigger threats. So this tended to play a more mid-range game. There were some modified synergies, but that really wasn't the way to land. So you'll see like we don't have the 3-mana 1 red green, put a counter and give haste to a creature, because that just tended to not play well. Instead, we'd rather just put down an early threat and then add another threat, like a Harmonious Emergence, or make our threat better with something that turns into a threat, like a Tales of Master Shishiro. And then a card that wasn't generally regarded as good, but was fine in this deck, was Jukai Trainee. You weren't probably going to lose to a flyer with this deck because you're just trying to play a more mid-range game, and if they get to the late game, they're probably going to beat you whether they have a flyer or not. So these are probably better than Baneroot Grove Archers because you want to be attacking. You want to be a little more tempo-oriented and maybe a little mid-range. But these still were good blockers against like the mono red because they usually act as like a 3/3 blocker. So they could at least trade or maybe make so the opponent can't attack in without 2/4ing themselves. So they were fine there. But the colors just generally didn't play well because green is heavy enchantment, red is heavy artifact, and those just didn't play well together. So the way you would usually get into this deck is you'd either start out hoping you'd be mono red, with some of these strong run commons, and then red dries up, and black dries up, and blue isn't really there. Maybe you speculated on like a late Prancer or just some of these okay green cards, and you just supplement with that. Or you start out heavy green and you can't pair it with a black or a white, and you don't really see blue either, and you're just stuck with some whatever red cards that are like fine, but don't have like the synergies to make them very good. And then finally, white-red. Again, you really didn't want to play this as Samurai because having an aggressive strategy where you're just attacking with one creature tended to not work out well. Instead, you just want to say, I'm going to get on the ground as soon as I can with 1 and 2 drops, and then try and clear out blockers with like a Kami Flare or Voltage Surge, or make blocks tough for an opponent with a Regent's Authority that pumps my creature for 1 mana and leaves a +1/+1 counter back on the creature. Or like do your Ironhoof Boar Channel to kill the creature that's blocking, attack through to keep your creature alive. That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to play a mono red or a red / black game, but instead you were playing white cards instead of black cards or red cards, which wasn't as good. But this was a somewhat effective way to do it, where you had tons of 2 drops and 1 drops, and you just tried to push through. Of note, Songshaper was still good in this deck, though you weren't heavy artifact, because it did get down, and sometimes it could attack for 3 or 4, so it was fine there. Exemplar was fine if you could get multiple of them, so they could kind of help themselves out, or you had some boars to push through when you do attack, and it's just a 2/1 for 2. But overall, you really wanted to be a higher density of uncommons to maybe make this deck work, and that means like more snipers, more Kamanos, more automatons, smeltzers, Mishkos, cards like that. And that, if you're getting those types of cards, you can probably end up in another better deck. So this was kind of just, the draft kind of went wrong, but I'm going to make the most of it by just being as low to the ground as I can, 15 lands if I can, and just try and keep attacking. So that's our final 2-color pair, and then the last deck to look at is based off of the Kami War, a Mythic in the set. And the thought here is, if you were so fortunate as to open or get past like an early Kami War, gotta live a little, gotta have some fun, give it a try. Generally speaking, the best way to do that is trying to have a base 2-color, and then just get enough fixing to be able to splash your Kami War, plus a few other good cards in your splash colors. So the way this is designed is green is a base color because you're going to get your Grafted Growths to help you with fixing. And then you could either go like white or black as your secondary color. White is probably a little better if you get the good defensive speed cards, like your Air of Enlightenment, your Spirited Companions, or your Jukai Naturalist to be able to get some life leak and cast, some of these enchantments early. Or if you did see like more removal with black, maybe just some higher quality cards like Raids and Beetles to make, in particular Beetle, to make it tough for your opponent to grind you out. And then you could play like green with your black instead. But it was a little easier to find white, and then because you're already splashing, ideally you could have cards like Oath to stabilize in like your secondary color white rather than like a tertiary or worse color, because you might not have the planes, 1, 5, or 6 to play it. That being said, if you do have growths and terminals, you're happy to play Oath because you may be able to drop this on turn 5, for example, and just stabilize that point, or if you already have some pressure on board, you know, with like Naturalist, Mender, stuff like that, like you can just, you know, try and just continue playing pressure. And then good uncommons for this type of deck. It's like Prancer, stabilizes, blocks flyers, gains you some life. Behold, definitely worth splashing. Gloom Shrieker worth splashing to either like bring back your Kami War if somehow it died and wasn't exiled, or you know bring back another creature that you could that was enchantment maybe to just continue stabilizing or continue digging with like a companion or kill creatures with the life until you can get your Kami War. But just because you drop Kami War doesn't mean that like you're going to win.